Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for dialing in and making time for this webinar today. We had more than 300 people register for this webinar, so we know there's a lot of interest in clean energy standards. We have some outstanding speakers for today's webinar. We're going to kick off with some opening remarks from Bob Perciasepe, the president of C2ES. And then we're going to have Nikki Roy, who's the Climate Change and Environmental Policy Director for U.S. Representative Diana DeGette, give us the federal perspective on clean energy standards and provide an overview of her recent proposal. Then I'm going to provide an overview on our just released C2ES Clean Energy Standard Report. And then we'll have Laura Shields from the National Conference of State Legislatures give us an update on state activity with regard to clean energy standards. And then finally, we'll have Bruce Phillips, who's the director of the Northbridge Group, talk about linking a clean energy standard with other emission reduction programs. So first, a little bit about C2ES, the next slide. So we are an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization focused on strong policy and action to address climate change. We've been around for more than 20 years now. Our core mission is to forge practical solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, expand clean energy, and strengthen resilience to climate impacts. We are a convener of stakeholders, and we produce a lot of publications as well. Next slide. One of the unique features about C2ES is our Business Environment Leadership Council. You can see on the slide here, it includes top companies in the electric power, manufacturing, transportation, high tech, oil and gas, and finance sectors. It's one of the largest US-based group of companies devoted solely to addressing climate change. One of the benefits of the BELC is that it's multi-sectoral. So unlike trade associations, companies can talk to each other, they can talk to other companies rather, outside of their industry about climate policy. And we're grateful for the valuable contribution that these companies make and provide to our work. However, C2ES is solely responsible for its positions, its programs, and its publications. With that, I am going to hand it over to Bob Perciasepe, the president of C2ES, to help set up the stage for today's discussion.
Okay, thanks, Doug. The Clean Energy Standard Report that we're releasing today is in keeping with our own longstanding mission is to promote strong market-based policies, as Doug just outlined, particularly aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The 2018 report that we all saw last fall from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change really laid out a daunting task for the world if we wanted to keep the global average temperatures from rising more than 1.5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial levels. And so we know that we are, our backs are against the wall, so to speak, in terms of taking action and moving forward. So I could go into a long discussion of how we are at an urgent time here for climate change policy. I want to make sure that everybody knows that that's one of the key contexts here of talking about clean energy standards, and obviously we'll hear more during the discussion here about actions that are going on in the Congress. This chart here shows from the Energy Information Agency this year what their projections are of business as usual without the interjection of policy. And then the dotted lines are showing what we will need to do if we want to get to a decarbonized economy in the middle part of the century. I think the United States economy-wide has gone down, but we see it has started to go back up again. A big part of the decline has been related to the power sector. The power sector, which makes up about 30% of our total emissions, has actually dropped by 27%, which is a combination of market forces as well as some policy signals that were sent that started to make that pushed forward different decision-making processes at the utility and business level. However, as this forecast shows, we are not expecting to have significant progress without more policy. And so really what a clean energy standard is all about is policy that's going to help bending that business as usual line down and moving it closer to the dotted line. There'll be other policies needed. We'll need more than just a clean energy standard, but it is essential. It is an essential part. Yeah, let's do the next slide. So when you think about a clean energy economy and pathways to decarbonization, electricity is one of the basic pieces of that puzzle. And in the electricity sector alone, when we start looking at fuel switching and moving other parts of the economy like buildings or transportation to more electrification, we have to make sure that electricity is decarbonized. But when you look at it in the big picture, it's really fuel switching to electric sources and decarbonizing the electric power sector, and then obviously being more efficient over time. There are other pieces to the decarbonization puzzle, particularly in the manufacturing area and in technology we will need in some of those areas, but this is a key component to it. And I think we all know that the power sector is the linchpin. We can't get anywhere near where we need to go if we don't decarbonize the basic energy source that we use, which is electricity. Clean energy standards, and we'll hear this from the panel today, are an appealing option for a lot of reasons, again, which I'm not going to go into, which we will talk about today, for the power sector. We're also opening the door or peeking behind the curtain or whatever you want to call it in this report that we're releasing today, that there are opportunities to link a clean energy standard in the power sector with other parts of the economy. Not just because the electricity will be cleaner, but also how you can use market mechanisms between sectors. And so we're looking forward to hearing some of that. So these simultaneous efforts across all the different sectors are really what's going to be needed, but the power sector is a key component of it, and clean energy standards are a great tool, among many others, that could be used to make progress in that forum. So I'm going to stop there with that high-level introduction and turn it over to, is Nikki next or Doug?
Yep. I'll just do a quick pass through. Thank you, Bob, for starting us off today and teasing out what the topics that we're going to touch on in more detail. You can go to the next slide. So we have these are our three experts for today. Unfortunately, Nikki Roy, who is representing the sort of federal discussion here, he has a time constraint. So we're going to let Nikki go first. And if people have questions for Nikki on his presentation, I encourage people to put those questions into the chat box in the webinar feature, and we can hopefully have a bit of time for a little Q&A with Nikki after he's finished with his introduction. So I'm going to pass it over to Nikki.
Great, thanks, Doug, and thanks to C2ES for hosting this webinar today and for inviting me to be part of it. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, so I work for Congresswoman DeGette. I'm her Climate Change and Environment Policy Director. The Congresswoman is very concerned about climate change, and she is, is very much in line with what Bob was saying at the beginning. We need to, essentially, in a nutshell, we need to electrify as much of the economy as we can and decarbonize electricity. There's many other things we need to do as well, but those are very key. And so she has asked me to prepare for her consideration a clean energy Innovation and Deployment Bill. We have released a summary of that bill and are floating a discussion draft of the Clean Energy Standard part of it, which I'll focus on in a second. And if anybody on this call would like to receive copies of any of that, please do contact my office. Doug, I think my email address might be available. Anyway, if you could make my email address available, I'd be happy to correspond with anybody on this. The bill discussion draft that we prepared is basically founded on these three observations, which is that we seem to have available. No, I'm sorry. Go back to that previous slide. Yeah, thanks. So we seem to have on hand the technology that would allow us to cut the power sector's carbon emissions by 80%. And there are a few assumptions there. One is that we retain the existing nuclear fleet. We dramatically increase the use of renewable energy, but then there's also some increased, at least dispatch of natural gas, and maybe some new building of natural gas, and then we can get to an 80% reduction. But even so, the main investor-owned utility in Colorado is Xcel. Xcel was one of the first, I think, the first of the big such companies to say that it was going to go to net zero by 2050, net zero emissions by 2050. But even they can't tell you how they're going to get past 80%. They're making that net zero statement because they trust that innovation will provide us the technology that's needed. But we don't have it in hand. And since they made that pledge, several other large utilities have made similar statements, and they're all pretty much in the same place. 80% seems to be about where we are now. However, as Bob was saying, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 1.5 report tells us that we need to reach net zero by no later than 2050, and frankly, we should be going much faster. That's a statement about the entire world. The United States should be ahead of the rest of the world, and the power sector. I think there's a lot of hope and belief that the power sector could lead the United States in this. So because we don't have the technology to eliminate that last 20% of emissions, and we have to get to net zero by no later than 2050 and hopefully much sooner, we have to be open to and invest in the widest possible array of zero emitting technologies. And that's what we're doing with our bill. Next slide, please. So again, it's currently a discussion draft. There are 4 titles to it. In the first title, is sort of the innovation title, and you hear in Congress right now we've had a little bit of a sea change in the last year, where last year many in the Republican Party were not really talking about climate solutions. Many are now, and what they often tend to go to is this concept of innovation, and innovation in this context tends to mean federal investment in various technologies and operating on key obstacles that various technologies face. So, for example, for advanced nuclear, our Nuclear Regulatory Commission is not necessarily geared to reviewing some of the newer nuclear technologies with carbon capture, utilization, and storage. There's a question of the infrastructure and the liability and various things that need to be resolved to really deploy that at scale, with energy storage, with offshore wind. There are various R&D investments that we need to make. So that first title is basically about supporting innovation through investment in critical clean energy technologies. And then we have 2 deployment titles. The second deployment title is a clean energy standard, which of course is the topic of this webinar today. The third, and I'll come back to that in a second, the third title is accelerated deployment of breakthrough technologies. And the notion there is what happens if Mr. Fusion shows up in 2032? You know, what happens if seasonal energy storage shows up in the 2030s? That could give us the 20%. You know, that could give us the technology that we need to achieve that last 20% reduction. But we don't want to just coast to 2050. We want to move as quickly as possible from our current emitting technologies, retire them as quickly as possible, move to non-emitting technologies. So Title III is a mechanism that basically provides lots of federal support for the rapid deployment of the breakthrough technologies. And then Title IV is would provide assistance for low-income ratepayers along the lines of the Weatherization Assistance Program and LIHEAP. Next slide, please. And just to focus, this will focus on the Clean Energy Standard. So as is typical with many renewable energy standards and clean energy standards that you see at the state level and proposals that we have at the federal level as well, there's an excellent clean energy standard bill that's already been introduced in this Congress by Senator Smith of Minnesota and Congressman Lujan of New Mexico, and in previous Congresses, Senator Bingaman wrote an outstanding bill back in 2012. And so, like those, this bill would have power companies provide an increasing fraction of their electricity through clean energy. And basically, the power companies would start with the fraction that they have now and go in a straight line increase to 100% of their 100% of their electricity being generated through non-emitting resources by 2050. All zero and low emitting technologies would be credited to the extent that they emit less carbon dioxide than a modern efficient coal burning power plant. So obviously renewable energy would be included, you know, the classic sort of solar, wind, geothermal, but also hydro, including large scale hydro, fossil with carbon capture and storage, nuclear, even natural gas would get credit to the extent that it emits less carbon dioxide than a coal burning power plant. Though in the case of natural gas, we also would look at the upstream methane loss to be counted into the carbon intensity, because that's a very important part of the picture, and we can't leave that out. As mentioned, every power company would be required to get to 100% clean energy by 2050, except that there would be an alternative compliance payment. The alternative compliance payment is instead of submitting a clean energy credit for a year, if the price of a clean energy credit is too high, a power company could submit an alternative compliance payment. In 2050, the alternative compliance payment would be set at the projected cost of a clean energy standard that has an 80% end goal, 80% reduction end goal. So, as I said earlier, a lot of the power sector is saying that we have the technology in hand to get us to an 80% reduction. We've structured the alternative compliance payment in our bill so that if we don't get any more technology, if the technology doesn't show up by 2050, you don't start paying, you know, through the roof. We just deploy the current technology. On the other hand, if we do get the technology, then we continue to get reductions well past 80%. The revenue that is brought in from the alternative compliance payment would be used to pay for cost-effective carbon mitigation activities that are related to electricity. So, for example, beneficial electrification of space heat and water heat, generation of liquid fuels using electricity, and because there are opportunities to do that are very likely to have a lower marginal cost than the marginal cost of reducing carbon dioxide from a power plant in a year that the clean energy credit price goes above an alternative compliance payment. you're actually not only not busting the carbon budget in a year when you are paying the alternative compliance payment, you're actually beating the carbon budget. So this is how we get to net zero. This is a genuine net zero formula. So I think those are the high points, and let me stop there and see if anybody has questions.
Sorry, I had a little trouble with the mute button there. Sorry. Have you done some modeling with regard to this proposal?
We've worked with organizations that have done modeling of proposals somewhat like this to get some insights and to do the initial design work. And there are a couple of organizations that are working together on some modeling now, but that modeling has not been completed.
So, but do you have any rough idea of how quickly this would, let's say by 2030 or 2035, what kind of emission reduction you might be looking at? Just a ballpark figure to give people an idea of how effective and how quickly a clean energy standard can act. Do you have any sort of rough back of the envelope assessment, or not at this point?
Well, what we have committed to is that and this is something that we can only do once the modeling, once we get a little clearer view of the modeling. We've committed to having the increase in clean energy that's required of each of the companies get us to a point that where we're reducing carbon dioxide emissions by 50% by 2030. By 2030, and so at least that's one metric, 50% reduction from 2005 levels by 2030.
Yeah, so
that will be baked into that. That'll be baked into the standard.
Right. So I mean, these things can act fairly quickly. And do you have a sense of how much coal generation is left by 2030?
Unfortunately, we don't have the modeling is not there to let us know. I will say that we're being careful to we're being careful to clarify that what we're talking about is emitting versus non-emitting, as opposed to one energy source versus another energy source. So if we get if folks listening might be familiar with Net Power's work on the Allen cycle. I know there's some other companies that are working on carbon capture methods. It could be that one of the technologies that shows up at scale and cost effective would be the CC, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. In which case you could see some of these fossil fuels, lasting for a while, as long as they're not releasing that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
All right, so I have to ask you a political question. So, durability.
Sure.
Durability is critical for climate policy. We need to be consistent, and we need to, have a long-term view here. So, in your estimation, how, by expanding the definition of clean and your previous work with clean energy standards, do you think it will be easier to get more bipartisan support for a clean energy standard as opposed to something that is more all-encompassing?
Well, so I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I know that we're getting, Doug and many of you on this call, I've been doing this for a while. I used to very proudly work for C2ES for 14 years myself, and at that time for 10 of those years worked on cap and trade, and I know that we're getting very constructive engagement from a lot of companies, and which makes me feel that at least the question of are we hitting on a formula that seems to be where common ground might be, because we're sort of getting positive signals from the environmental community, positive signals from the industry. So I think in terms of the substance, we are sort of hovering above common ground, and I think that's very promising. Now, there's these days, unfortunately, it's not, and this is maybe always true, it's unfortunately not the case that you can just count on the substantive right answer to carry the day politically. And I think obviously a lot of the there are a lot of places around the country where constituents don't like to hear about climate change. They've been convinced somehow that 97% of climate scientists are incorrect, and but even in those places, there tends to be a lot of support for the idea that we need to be driving clean energy forward, for not only for the other health and environmental benefits, but because it'll modernize our energy system. It'll make us a global competitor in the global booming market for energy. Don't want to leave that all to China and to other countries. So I think those aspects of focusing on clean energy may make this, in addition to the substance, may help us get a good audience with our Republican friends. We are engaged and having very good conversation with folks on the other side of the aisle, but we're not. Nobody's locked in yet.
All right, I know you're up against a time crunch here, so I'll just thank you for participating today. We did have a lot of questions. Unfortunately, we can't get to all the ones that came through at this time, so apologies to the audience for that.
I apologize as well. We're the Energy and Commerce Committee, on which my boss sits, is having a markup, and I need to get back to that. So, but thanks for the time that you did give me, and I look forward to interacting with anybody who does reach out. Take care now.
Thank you, and we'll also share Nikki's email address so people can reach out and get the information about this proposal and any other questions that they may have. So let's move on to the next slide. So next slide, please. Right, so apologies for the order of the speakers today, because my portion that's coming here was meant to be a bit of a primer, an introduction for people who are not familiar with clean energy standards. And Nikki's proposal, mentioned a lot of concepts like alternative compliance payments, and those are features of market-based systems that help help control the costs. But there was a lot of other jargon and a lot of other technology. I'll just try to explain a little bit, and we do this fairly well, I think, in our new report that we just released. So there's a few ways that come to mind of reducing emissions from the power sector. There's carbon pricing, which includes things like cap and trade or a carbon tax. There are various forms of regulation that have been proposed, like a technology-based emission performance standards that we saw out of the EPA during the Obama era version of the Clean Power Plan. And then there are things like electricity portfolio standards, of which a clean energy standard is one form. So our report, we talk about electricity portfolio standards. This current report, Clean Energy Standards, State and Federal Policy Options and Considerations, is an update to our 2011 report. And it's amazing how much the clean energy landscape has changed in the last 8 years. Natural gas has overtaken coal to become the largest source of electric power. There have been 68 gigawatts of coal plant that have been retired. That's like 20 or 25% of the coal fleets retired. And that has sent coal's share of electric generation from 42% down to 27%. Renewables have gotten a lot cheaper and are growing more quickly. With new inexpensive electricity supply and very little demand growth, several nuclear plants have shut down prematurely relative to their operating licenses. And surprise, surprise, we are still lacking a comprehensive national or federal policy for electric power. So what is in our report? As I mentioned, it's comprehensive. The report introduces the concept of a clean energy standard and how it works. It covers the status and outlook for clean energy in the United States. It looks at advantages and disadvantages of the clean energy standard. It looks at past federal proposals around the 2011-2012 timeframe. We just heard about a new proposal that came out after our paper was put together, so that is not included or compared in the current paper. It looks at state action on clean energy standards, and we're going to get an update on that after in a moment or two. And the paper dives into a lot of issues around policy design options and their implications. Another feature too that Bob alluded to in his opening remarks is that we look at how a clean energy standard might be expanded beyond the power sector to be interoperable with an emission program in another sector. So kind of a bit of a basic Clean Energy Standard 101. A lot of you may be familiar with something called a Renewable Portfolio Standard. These were widely adopted by states in the late 1990s and 2000s. And a typical renewable portfolio standard called for a state to get 20% of its electricity from renewable sources, usually from wind power, solar power, or small hydro, by a particular target date, say 2020. So in its simplest form, a clean energy standard is an expanded form of a renewable portfolio standard. A clean energy standard might require a state to get 70% of its electricity from clean sources by 2030, and those clean sources would include wind and solar and hydro, but they'd also include nuclear power and fossil fuel generation with carbon capture and storage. Allowing a broad range of clean energy sources to qualify provides flexibility and allows more ambitious clean energy targets to be achieved sooner. For example, if a state has a renewable portfolio standard to achieve 50% of its generation from wind, solar, and hydro by 2030, and it converted that to a clean energy standard that allowed, say, existing nuclear generation to qualify, that state could achieve an 80% or more clean energy by the same date. A state like New York or New Jersey gets 30 or 40% of its electricity from nuclear power. How can you make a clean energy standard market-based? Well, under a clean energy standard, a state utility would have an obligation to supply, say, 50% of its power from qualified clean sources. And as a mechanism of ensuring that it's doing that, it would be issued clean energy credits for each clean energy megawatt hour that it generates. It could earn those credits by generating the electricity itself. It could contract for clean delivery, or it could purchase those credits from another utility that is producing more clean energy than it needs to comply with its obligations. So allowing a market-based credit trading system across states, regions, or nationally facilitates lower cost compliance. And can clean energy standards work with other sectors' emission reduction programs? The short answer is yes. A key focus of that process is developing some kind of linking mechanism or an accounting system, which would connect a ton of emission reductions from a power sector clean energy standard with a ton of emission reduction from a program in another sector. And we'll hear more about that a little bit further in this webinar. Next slide. So I'm just going to focus on, in the short time that we have here, on a few of the insights from our report. Bob highlighted this well. So modeling from the EIA and from other sources show that market forces alone and the current policies that we have are not going to drive us to the level of clean electricity deployment that we know is necessary by mid-century. We're going to need a new sector-wide, a national policy like a clean energy standard in order to help bend the needle and move toward that goal. The report also underscores the important climate, environment, and public health benefits of clean energy. It addresses the issue of fuel diversification. Having a range of zero emission sources, all with different attributes, can lower costs and reduce system risks. Also, decarbonizing the electric sector is key to decarbonization in other sectors. There are still some other challenges to come beyond electrification, but electrification for vehicles in the transportation sector, for heating and hot water in buildings, will reduce emissions significantly in those sectors. And the lower the carbon intensity or the cleaner that the electricity is, the greater the emissions reduction will be in those sectors. The next insight is that a clean energy standard provides more flexibility for utilities to meet ambitious clean energy targets. Certain states and regions have lower potential or less ideal conditions for wind, solar, or hydro than others. And that's either because it's less windy, it's less sunny, they don't have the water or the topography for hydro, or because the state is densely populated or their lands are otherwise protected. So allowing fossil fuel fired generation with carbon capture technology or nuclear or advanced nuclear to qualify for a clean energy standard likely increases the participation of states that have been laggards in the clean energy space, which can increase the political appeal of clean energy standard. Final point is that a clean energy standard can be more effective when credit trading between participants is allowed. The use of tradable credits to demonstrate compliance gives electric utilities compliance flexibility, and it helps keep costs low since no electric utility needs to generate or deliver any specific quantity of clean energy by itself. Next slide. All right, so now we are going to hear from Laura Shields. Laura is an Energy Policy Associate for the Environment, Energy, and Transportation Program at the National Conference of State Legislatures. She analyzes regulatory and legislative trends related to energy efficiency, renewable energy, and greenhouse gas emissions. Laura received her Juris Doctor degree from the University of Colorado. Prior to joining NCSL, Laura worked as an attorney at the Environmental Defense Fund, where she focused on transportation-related Clean Air Act issues at the federal and state level. Laura, I hand it over to you.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks to C2ES for hosting this webinar and providing the opportunity to discuss some really exciting developments in federal and state clean energy policy. Next slide. So here's just an outline of what I plan to cover today. And given time, I'm just going to dive right in. So next slide. So a little bit about NCSL. We're a bipartisan organization that serves legislators and their staff in the 50 states, commonwealths, and territories. We provide information and research on a variety of policy issues and help facilitate the exchange of knowledge and ideas between policymakers. The Energy Program publishes a number of policy resources, and I've included links to those resources in some of my slides. We also lobby on behalf of states' interests in Washington, D.C. Next slide. So here's just a list of the key topic areas that the Energy Program covers. I won't run through all of these, but it's just to show you the kind of breadth and range of the different areas that we're tracking in state policy. Next slide. So states have taken a variety of approaches to implementing clean energy standards. This includes the stringency of their overall targets, as well as what resources count toward achieving a particular target or goal. Next slide. So I'll start with an overview of a policy that Doug mentioned previously, which is the Renewable Portfolio Standard or Renewable Energy Standard. This map shows which states have enacted renewable energy standards, the dark green states showing those states that have binding targets, and the light green states showing which states have voluntary targets or goals. So as you'll see, 29 states have adopted these policies, and if you're interested in learning more about kind of the details of the policies implemented in these states, NCSL provides a resource on that, and there's a link to that in the slide. Next slide. So in addition to how states define renewable energy sources that can count toward meeting their target, states also provide for efficiency to play a role in some circumstances. For example, you have North Carolina that implements a combined renewable energy and energy efficiency standard that allows a utility to meet an increasing percentage of their overall compliance obligation with efficiency measures as the state approaches its highest target of 12.5%. Next slide. So in addition to having renewable energy standards in place, some states are also enacting really aggressive clean energy standards. And so what this means varies depending on which state you're in. If you look to Washington, for example, that recently enacted a 100% clean energy standard. In that legislation, they broadly define non-emitting electrical generation to include electricity from a generating facility or resource that does not emit greenhouse gases as a byproduct of energy generation. When you compare that to its definition of renewable resource, you have, what you would typically think of as in an RPS with water, wind, solar energy, geothermal, renewable natural gas, and certain biodiesels and biomass. So again, with the 100% target, you have a much broader definition of what can count toward meeting that goal or target. Next slide. So here you see a map of states based on the stringency of the percentage target that they've set. So we've combined renewable energy targets and goals as well as clean energy targets and goals. And as you can see, the vast majority of states that have either a renewable energy standard or goal are kind of below that 50% threshold. And then you have a handful of states that are above 50% but below 100%. And then you have your handful of states that have enacted 100% targets or goals. Next slide. So again, we've touched on this earlier on in the webinar. Doug mentioned it. So what counts as clean? These are just some of the terms that we've seen in these pieces of clean energy legislation. And it really varies, again, depending on which state you're in. If you look to New Mexico, for example, their definition of renewable energy, again, includes solar, wind, geothermal, certain types of biomass, landfill gas, but it explicitly excludes use of fossil fuels or nuclear energy. And then when you look at their definition of zero carbon resource for their 100% CES target, you see a broader definition that includes electricity generation that emits no carbon into the atmosphere. It also provides for sources that reduce methane emissions. So again, it's kind of narrowly tailored to the state's interest in reducing a particular greenhouse gas. Next slide. So as I mentioned in the intro, NCSL is really active in tracking state legislation. We have a tracking database. And so as I go into state activity, I've pulled all of that from our own database. And I did that by pulling bills related to energy efficiency, renewable energy, and greenhouse gas reductions. And so when we look at these stats, it's kind of the bigger picture of all of these clean energy related bills, not necessarily bills that are focused on setting targets. Next slide. So this most recent legislative session, we saw 1,500 bills that were under consideration that were clean energy related. Of these, 550 are still pending and roughly 200 were enacted. And as you can see, there was an interest in this policy area across the United States with Democratic controlled legislatures as well as Republican controlled legislatures taking an interest in this policy area. I've also included a link to our tracking database for those of you interested in checking it out. I've listed the leaders there in terms of which states in which states we saw the most activity, and just wanted to highlight Virginia and Minnesota as two states where we saw a lot of activity in the clean energy space. Next slide. So we saw a number of states kind of drilling down into the clean energy standard or target, percentage target space. We saw a number of states enact really aggressive either renewable energy or clean energy targets this most recent legislative session. We saw Maryland increase its RPS to 50% and then look into or conduct a study to assess the feasibility of increasing that standard further and adopting a clean energy standard. Next slide. So here are the details on some of those bills. as you can see, kind of a commonality between all of them is setting these really aggressive renewable or clean energy percentage requirements. But we also saw a trend of legislatures mandating that decision makers consider equity in how to implement these targets, and as well as facilitate the transition to a clean energy economy and provide the tools and resources necessary to communities that are dependent on fossil fuels to support their local economy to kind of transition away from that and toward a clean energy future. Next slide. So here's some pieces of legislation that are still pending that I wanted to highlight. You have Pennsylvania considering a bill that would establish limits on the amount of non-renewable energy that could supply electricity in the state. And so it's kind of like a reverse RPS. And then also would establish 100% renewable energy goal by 2050. Minnesota, there's a couple pieces of legislation as well that would establish a more aggressive clean energy target and would also establish different requirements based on whether a utility had existing nuclear generation. And so that kind of provides an interesting example of a certain state approach to nuclear. Next slide. So in terms of legislation that we're seeing a lot of activity in this space, and it's definitely the most popular policy area that we track, and so we're anticipating continuing to see a lot of state action in this space. Next slide. So here are some of the trends that we're seeing. A lot of states are increasing their RPS requirements, some up to 50, 70%, where they were much lower. We're seeing an increasing number of states set these really aggressive 100% clean energy standards or zero emission standards for the power sector. But in these pieces of legislation, we're also seeing a lot of states specifically mandate that whether it's utility commissions or state agencies, consult with environmental justice communities, make equity considerations in their decision making, and also give communities the support that they need to transition away from a fossil fuel dependent economy. We're also seeing a lot of bills relating to funding for clean energy programs, whether that's protecting existing funding mechanisms or creating new funding mechanisms. And then we're also seeing a lot of carbon pricing legislation being introduced in Democratic states as well as Republican states. Next slide. And so that's all I have. I'd be happy to go into any of these slides in more detail in the Q&A session. And if folks have more questions, they can follow up with me. And there's my contact info.
Thank you, Laura. I think that's a great overview of the current landscape. You certainly highlighted, for me at least, some of the challenges in looking at all the different ways that states or the categories that they use for what they consider to be clean generation. So I think that's an interesting debate. You know, if we can come to some kind of consensus, would be fantastic. So next up, I would like to introduce Bruce Phillips. And Bruce is a director of the Northbridge Group, which is an economic and strategic consulting firm serving the electric and natural gas industries. He has more than 30 years of experience advising companies in the electric utility, competitive power marketing, natural gas pipeline, and gas marketing industries, as well as government agencies and nonprofit organizations. He helps them to assess and implement strategies to improve economic and environmental performance. Bruce has a BA from the College of the Atlantic and an MFS and an MBA from Yale University. With that, Bruce, I hand the floor over to you.
Okay, well, thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, loud and clear.
Great. Okay, well, so let me just add my Laura and to Nikki's, and thank you, Doug and Bob and CTUS for hosting this event and inviting me. So appreciate that. So to start with, you know, most of what we've talked about so far on this webinar has to do with clean energy standards applied to the electric sector by itself. And both Doug and Bob made reference to the potential to sort of link clean energy standards in the electric sector to other sectors of the economy, and that's which is what I'm going to talk about. And I think this is entirely appropriate. You know, as was said earlier, the electric sector is really considered the linchpin to decarbonize other sectors. But at the same time, I think there were some numbers that Bob showed earlier that the electric sector represented, say, roughly 1/3 of United States carbon emissions, with other sectors responsible for the other 2/3 of carbon emissions. So a lot of emissions in other sectors of the economy that we're going to need to address at some point in time. And in the second, you know, caveat around clean energy standards is that this relatively limited sectoral scope of just being focused on the electric or power sectors is an issue for the performance of the program. So can we forward to the next slide? Yeah. And I'm now realizing I should have forwarded to this slide earlier. So I've covered this one. Let's move on to the next, if we could. So one way to address some of the issues associated with the relatively limited sectoral scope of a clean energy standard is to think about whether and how to somehow link a clean energy standard program to other emissions reduction programs or clean energy programs in other sectors of the economy. And so what do we mean by linkage? As it says here in this slide, it's a mutual formal recognition of 2 or more programs so that the reductions in each program may be used to comply with the other. So if we have, you know, two different programs, one in the electric sector, one, say, in an industrial sector of the economy, they each have some type of clean energy or emission reduction program, that there would be a structure put in place for each of those 2 programs that would allow them to recognize reductions or clean energy generation in the other program as a means to comply with its own program. So this is not a new concept. It's been discussed in other situations and implemented in a number of different circumstances. It's currently used to harmonize separate cap and trade programs. You can think of the cap and trade program in California being linked to the cap and trade program in Quebec. That's just one example. It's been discussed in many other climate emission reduction programs, both in the United States and overseas. Another example would be linking separate state renewable portfolio standard programs, which happens fairly commonly around the United States, where state programs may allow credits generated in other states to be used to satisfy state compliance obligations. It's also used widely in the voluntary renewable standard contracts we see with corporations, where corporations use credits generated in some other state to satisfy a corporate obligation they have for a facility in a second state. So this is not a new concept. It's used in a number of other circumstances, and it's been proposed in yet more settings. There's a number of prominent economists here in the United States whose names many of you would recognize, that have developed and proposed mechanisms to harmonize cap and trade and carbon tax programs. So these would be, cap and trade programs that operate on a tonnage basis, and separate carbon tax programs that operate on a carbon tonnage basis. And there have been mechanisms proposed to allow each of those two programs to produce credits that would qualify for demonstration of compliance in the others. And so more to the point here for what we're talking about today, these same concepts that have been developed and applied in other program circumstances can be extended to address this issue of sectoral coverage for clean energy standards. In a couple different ways, a couple different examples here. One would be linking clean energy standard programs with carbon emission reductions, carbon tax programs, or cap and trade programs. And secondly, which is exactly, I think, on the point of what we're talking about here today, is linking clean energy programs with carbon reduction programs in other sectors. So outside of the electric sector, could be for industrial emissions of various sorts, could be in the transportation sector, and at least in concept in other sectors of the economy as well. And so it's this last point here on this slide that I'm going to talk about in particular. But I should just say before going on that the thoughts here that I'm sharing are based on a white paper that I've drafted that sort of focuses primarily in the first of these two sub-bullets, but I think the concepts can be expanded to the second, and that's really the basis for my my presentation here today. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the essence of this, and you might well ask, so how do we do this? If there's significant benefits to be had, what are the mechanics to do it? And this page sort of summarizes at a pretty high level the sort of central elements of what's required to do that. The foundational piece of it, and I think Doug, maybe mentioned this earlier in his discussion, but the foundational piece of it is to have a single standardized regulatory metric that is common across each program and fungible, so that participants in each of the two programs can trade freely and reliably using that standardized regulatory metric. And this can be achieved in the context of clean energy standards and emission programs or clean energy programs in other sectors by translating a clean energy credit, which is typically denominated in megawatt hours of electric energy, into the amount of carbon emissions that would be avoided by that clean energy credit. And so it's a translation from megawatt hours or some units of energy into tons of carbon emission reductions. And as long as one, the programs that are involved in linking, can revolve around one or the other of those two kind of standardized regulatory metrics that can be trading back and forth. And how do we do that trading? There's three main elements of it. One is we need to establish an exchange ratio between megawatt hours of clean energy and tons of carbon. And so the ratio would be the rate at which clean energy and carbon credits can be exchanged. So this would be megawatt hours of clean energy and tons of carbon credits, the ratio at which those two could be exchanged freely. As I said before, the tons of CO2 avoided would be the metric there. So we have to establish an exchange ratio for these two metrics. The second element of this is the process to sort of demonstrate compliance. So these, we're supposing two separate programs here where participants in each of these programs have a regulatory obligation to demonstrate compliance. They have a process in each program that they need to go through to make sure that they're showing that they're in compliance with the respective program. And in this instance, buyers would turn in credits in each of their programs that account for the exchange ratios. So we may have a participant in a carbon reduction program that are turning in some number of clean energy megawatt hours to demonstrate compliance, and there's an exchange ratio that we talked about before that need to be taken into account to do that. Importantly, to avoid double counting in each program, both programs would have to have a system to account for the impact of these trades on emission inventories and their requirements. Because otherwise, in concept, we'd have a situation where somebody could be using credits to sort of double count their way to compliance in each program, which would simply be bypassing the intent behind the linking to start with. The third element is an institutional aspect of this. We need an administrative process, an overarching administrative process that needs to be agreed upon and approved by both programs, with a transparent methodology to do the first two of these three things, the exchange ratios and the process to demonstrate compliance. We need transparent methodologies that have been agreed upon by the programs to sort of carry this out. And this would, in concept, at least in best, be carried out by some kind of independent entity without a financial stake in the outcome of these kinds of trades. So this could be done by one of the programs, or the second program, or a third program that would overarch either one of them. And there's many sort of subsidiary issues and mechanics and math that kind of goes on, underneath these three main program kind of elements. So a lot of details. The details would matter. And so, not surprisingly, there's also a number of ways that these processes might be designed and implemented. I think the CQS paper that's being released today has a section at the back that outlines one approach to doing this, but there's probably others as well. And I think at the end of the day, if there are folks that believe that there's value associated with this and are interested in exploring it, some kind of a stakeholder process to kind of map out the various alternatives and discuss the trade-offs associated with each one and work towards a common set of mechanisms that would be acceptable to stakeholders would be a productive way to go forward. So let me stop there and turn it back to you, Doug.
Thank you, Bruce. I think you laid out the linking issue really well there. So I was just going to ask, the audience can get your white paper by emailing you, or is it available on the website?
I don't believe we've put that out on the website. I could look into doing that, but probably the most straightforward way, if people want to just email me, I can quickly get back to them with a copy of it.
Great. And I totally agree with you. I think transparency is key. You just have to lay it out and make it very transparent what your accounting process for everyone to see, to lay it bare. Also, another example that we cite in the paper, you talked about California and Quebec linking. We know Alberta had a program as well that linked not only industries but also power as well in their emissions reduction program. So now we're going to have a few minutes of discussion where I just remind everybody that we are carefully noticing all of the questions that are coming in. Invite you to continue to type your questions into the chat box. We'll have a few minutes of moderated discussion, and we'll move into the audience questions. But just quickly, since we're on the subject of your linkage, Bruce, I just thought I'd get off one question that's sort of short. Have you considered, or have you guys given any thought, I can't recall in the white paper, to how biofuels would be treated in your conversion?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and there's there's a lot. We've not yet had an opportunity to go in and sort of think through, but I think that as long as there could be a credible and understandable process and methodology to quantify the carbon emission benefits of the biofuel program that you're talking about, that's the key question here. And I don't see any reason why that kind of methodology couldn't be established. But that would be the precursor and sort of the necessary condition to do this kind of linking. And as long as that could be done, I don't see any reason why those two kind of programs might not be linked.
Very good, thanks. So I think over the course of the webinar, we pointed out a lot of different ways that you can decarbonize the power sector. And Laura, I believe, used this line that the clean energy proposals seem to be the most popular. And I'm curious why, Bruce, you can weigh in as well. Laura, why do you think that they're so popular now? Why is there so much interest in clean energy standards or clean energy targets?
So I think there's an increasing interest in this policy area, mostly because of the interest in conserving energy, as well as these kind of emerging technologies as being really interesting areas to kind of spur economic development as well as innovation. And so kind of across the board, we see states interested in these areas. In terms of setting targets or goals, there's a smaller number of states that are enacting legislation in this space, but there's a growing number of states that are considering legislation in that space. So I anticipate that will continue, and more states will consider or engage in studies to assess the feasibility of setting more aggressive targets in their states. But we're just generally seeing a lot of interest in moving toward a clean energy economy.
And if I could just jump in with
Sure.
one other quick thought on that, I guess from at least from my kind of more limited view than what Laura has, it seems to me that many states are interested in these kind of policies in part because of the carbon emission consequences, but also because of the whole host of other policy goals they have that revolve around the development of energy infrastructure in their states. And so it's about industrial development, it's about jobs, and it's about sort of helping to create a economic future for many states. And so when we look at the particular provisions of clean energy standards and renewable portfolio standards at the state level, and we go down in looking at the real details, below the level of what, Laura described earlier, there's tremendous diversity in these programs at the state level. And that reflects, I think, the ability of states to structure and tailor a particular program in a particular state to the circumstances and goals of those states. And so I think some of this is part of the benefit is the ability of states to control their own energy destiny through these kinds of programs.
So, Laura, just following up a little bit on what you said, do you see that these are progressing, or do you have any metric or way of seeing that these are progressing more quickly, or do they like arise in the same legislative session and pass quickly? In the past, it felt like some of these proposals could go on for 4 or more legislative sessions before anything would happen. But it seems like there's just been just like a cascade of announcements in 2019. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think that's a fair characterization. I also think it completely depends on the state. I mean, you see, for example, Colorado, there was a smaller number of bills introduced, but in terms of the bills that were actually enacted in the clean energy space, it was, comparable with some states that had close to 100 bills introduced. And so I think it really depends. You also have a number of clean energy related bills in states like Minnesota and Illinois that were introduced earlier on in this most recent legislative session that are still pending and didn't move very far but could move next session. And so I think it completely depends on the state in terms of how quickly they're able to introduce and then enact legislation.
Are you seeing greater bipartisan support in the legislature? So do you have an example of a state that may have not had as much bipartisan support, say for a renewable portfolio standard, but then when it became a clean energy standard or became a more inclusive policy, it garnered more support within the legislature?
So I'm not sure about that particular connection. I do know that, like, for example, the bill that I highlighted, the Clean Energy First bill that I highlighted, that's currently pending in Minnesota, that has bipartisan support. There's a number of clean energy related bills in Michigan that have bipartisan support that are moving and currently under consideration and will be taken up next session. So I think in terms of whether there's more bipartisan support for a clean energy standard versus a renewable portfolio standard, I'm not sure about that. But I do know that there's increased interest, and I do think it's partly driven by the call to action to act now and not wait and not put it off. So that's why we're kind of seeing more bipartisan cooperation.
So I think Bruce mentioned it, and I directly asked Nikki about the effectiveness of a clean energy standard by itself to affect emission reductions. So we know that back in May, Lujan Smith National Clean Energy Standard proposal was evaluated by RFF, and they found that there would be a 76% reduction in power sector emissions from 2005 levels by 2035. They saw that generation from renewables increased 30 to 56% under that proposal. It avoided the retirement of 43 gigawatts of nuclear power and saw 10 to 18% increase above the business as usual from nuclear power in 2035. And all of these things happen. It saw a reduction in fossil generation from 60% down to 26% by 2035, which is a pretty dramatic flip. And then that really just resulted in an increase of retail electricity rates of only about 4%, which seems pretty remarkable to get that kind of transformation. So a long wind up to a fairly simple question, but is a clean energy standard that I'm not sure that any states have actually put trading involved or trading into their clean energy standard. But I mean, should we be pursuing something more sophisticated than just a clean energy standard? Or maybe this is to you, Bruce. Do you think that this is a worthwhile step in the transition to clean energy?
Yes, certainly. And there's of course many, alternative carbon emission reduction policies that have been put forward, including, carbon pricing policies of various sorts. And on these, my view is, we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to kind of pursue the policies that policymakers and stakeholders will adopt. And any of these kinds of policies can have, in an economic sense, benefits, many times program costs, and so they're all worthwhile to be done. And I think what's been demonstrated clearly at the state level is that there's tremendous interest in renewable portfolio standards and carbon emission standards. I thought your point that you just made of that, the clean energy standards that we tend to see at the state level so far, they don't necessarily take the same form as what we're talking about at the federal level with a sort of technology neutral market-based kind of a structure with trading. They tend to be more targeted towards individual technologies, or else expressed as a legislative goal without a lot of mechanism yet to be developed. But I suspect over time, personally, as these goals get translated into policy mechanisms, and as we go further down the path of deploying these technologies, we'll transition out of the situation we're on today, where there's an awful lot that can be done for very little cost, and to a situation where it'll be more and more important to get to deeper levels of market penetration, to have a full array of zero carbon technologies on the table, and that would push towards technology neutral and market-based kind of a policy approach, more akin to what's being talked about at the federal level. So,
great, thanks for that. So we're getting a lot of questions about natural gas here, so I want to just touch on that a little bit, and certainly Nikki talked a bit about natural gas and his proposal. It's interesting, just in power sector emissions have dropped a lot since 2005, and even since I did some statistics comparing how much power sector emissions have even fallen since 2011, and a lot of that is due to more natural gas and natural gas generation. So we've seen a 19% of that power sector emission decline has actually happened since 2011 to 2018, and natural gas share of the power sector mix has jumped 10% from 25 to 35%. And Nikki talked about in his proposal crediting natural gas. I think they use clean or an efficient rather coal plant as their reference for to determine what is clean. Everything is done relative to an efficient coal plant. But I guess the details of that will emerge eventually. But my question is, do you think that natural gas, and I believe in the Lujan Smith bill there was crediting of natural gas as well, should natural gas receive a credit as a cleaner fossil fuel? Do you have any thoughts from what the modeling shows, or your own experience, Bruce?
Yeah, so I am in the camp where of folks that have the view that it's worthwhile and important to credit natural gas for its carbon emission benefits. As much emission reductions as we've seen, as you mentioned, Doug, over the last 10, 15 years, that's due to the displacement of coal with natural gas. As big as those emission reductions have been, and as you point out, they've been quite substantial. It's still going forward a very large opportunity in tonnage terms, and a very inexpensive emission reduction opportunity as well. So because it's large and because it's cheap, I tend to think it's important and valuable to pursue that. And I think over time, as these emission standards and clean energy standards get tightened, it'll start to become also necessary to put carbon capture equipment on the gas plants we have, or figure out how to build new natural gas plants that are don't emit carbon dioxide, to begin with, or else shift away from natural gas over time. But looking at the next increment of emission reductions here in the next number of years, I think it's a large and inexpensive opportunity. That'd be my view.
Yep. So we're also getting a lot of questions too about ensuring a just transition. So either of you can weigh in on this, and I think, Laura, you alluded to it in some of the bills that you discussed. So as we decarbonize the economy, obviously it's crucial that we ensure a just transition. So how would a clean energy standard be designed to provide transition assistance, I guess, maybe for thinking about coal communities and thinking about low income households. Have there been some precedents in some of the bills that have passed, Laura?
Yeah, so we've seen in New Mexico and Colorado discussion of ensuring that impacted communities are part of the decision-making process. And New Mexico, I believe in particular, provides for a committee to be created, as well as funding for job training, job assistance, as well as technical assistance for communities that are transitioning away from coal. And so I think that's just one model that can be used. But I think also just, and in addition to Colorado, New York also is creating, I believe in their clean energy standard that they just passed, that same bill created an environmental justice advisory group. And so creating committees or groups specifically tasked with ensuring that those voices are part of the conversation and part of the decision-making process. I think those are two models that I'm aware of.
Great. Bruce, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I just echo what Laura said, and you know, I think in addition to the sort of the the securitization financing kind of mechanism, which is sort of embedded in the Colorado and New Mexico laws that Laura just talked about, you know, I think there's probably 2 or 3 other potential revenue streams that apply differently in different states. But, you know, I think these have been used in the past to support, you know, coal communities and low-income communities. But funds received from the sale of carbon allowances in RGGI and in California, you know, where we have these cap and trade programs, produce incremental revenues for states. And some states have chosen to use those for these purposes. A number of states have system benefit funds already in place that have been used for environmental purposes over the years, but these are a potential source of funds for coal communities and low-income communities. And then finally, I think there's maybe a couple states that have sort of moved to use effectively state funding that's been provided to fossil producers through either received through severance taxes or subsidies to fossil producers, and to sort of redirect some of those funds for these purposes as well. So I think there's probably a handful of different funding opportunities in concept, depending upon what part of the country folks are in.
Great. So switching gears a little bit here. So we have a question about, would anything specific need to be done for like existing clean generation that we have, say the nuclear and hydro? You know, nuclear makes up about 20% of our current electricity and 50-something% of our zero emission generation, and hydro is variable, I guess somewhere around 7% of US electricity generation. And just looking at the RFF modeling, my gut is that, you know, as a Smith-Lujan type of clean energy standard should accommodate the legacy or the existing clean generation that we have in the US. But what are your thoughts on that, Bruce?
Yeah, so I think this is an important issue, because we've seen you know, situations around the country, at least in some states, where existing zero carbon resources, especially you know, certain nuclear plants, but possibly including, you know, some hydro as well, have been receiving market revenues that are so limited so as not to cover their going forward costs. And you know, clearly this sort of is a case-by-case issue. In some instances, it's a problem. In a number of other instances, it would not be. So it's very case-specific. But where it does occur, having these kinds of large-scale zero-carbon resources retire typically means that a good chunk of the lost energy would be replaced by uncontrolled coal and gas plants, and that will increase system emissions. And so I think these kinds of broader technology neutral approaches to clean energy standards that encompass both existing zero carbon as well as new zero carbon help prevent that problem from emerging to the same extent.
Great. So I think we'll wrap up the questioning there. And I just want to thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Laura and Nikki, who had to drop off. But thanks. Do we have his email address, or Nikki? We'll send that out to the attendees today. And thanks everybody for your great questions. Apologies for not being able to get to them all today, but you can reach out to us here at C2ES, and we hope to continue the conversation with you. And thanks everybody for attending today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.